Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
On Monday, the Idaho legislature will convene and they will start a very important session, as it is each year. And this is in the year 2004. And we'd like to talk to you today about some of the major issues that may appear during that important legislative session. And we're so fortunate to have two real experts that follow the legislature very carefully to be with us. They've come up to Coeur d'Alene to do this, and we're grateful to them. First of all, I welcome to the program Joan Cartan-Hansen, who is a producer, reporter, and a writer for Idaho Public Television. And by the way, your programs are just outstanding, and we are grateful that you do that. And thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
And equally, we're so pleased to have Betsy Russell, who is from up here but now lives in Boise and is a reporter for the Spokesman Review. And we enjoy immensely your articles. They're done in great depth also. And thanks for coming and being with us. And we're pleased to have Erna Reinhardt, our panelist, who's the Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College. And Erna will start today's questioning on reviewing the upcoming session of the Idaho legislature.
Welcome, Betsy, and welcome, Joan. It's wonderful to have you in North Idaho. You both provide the state of Idaho such a wonderful resource and a link to Boise. And for those of us that live way up here in North Idaho, it's difficult for us to follow what happens in the legislature. So I just want to say that thank you. You provide a great resource for us. The session starts right away, and give us an outlook of how you see the state economy doing, how's the budget doing, and how do you think the revenues are going to be for this year? Let's start with Betsy.
Well, I think that things are certainly looking up. They're looking better than they were, but we do have a temporary sales tax increase that's part of our state budget. And while that will clearly carry us through the 2 years of its term, providing $160 million a year in revenues, it expires on July 1st of 2005. In this current budget year, we also had a federal bailout to the tune of $80 million plus that helped balance the state budget. So the toughest budget fight that's coming up may not even be for the year to come, but for the year after.
Exactly, Joan.
It does cast a very long shadow, and I think that as they set the budget this year and as they set revenue projections, they'll be looking down the road a bit, and there will be some fights within some of the legislative fractions talking about whether they should cut government this year to make a softer landing, they say, when that 1% tax is repealed. And there is no discussion at all about keeping that 1% on. They really want to try and keep that promise to cut that off. But in the first 5 months of this current fiscal year, and it's that confusing starts in July 1, they're about $30 million ahead in revenue projection, a baseline of projection of 3.2%. The revenue's coming in at about 5.5%. So that gives them a little bit of a cushion to work with. And that the only major expenses that JFAC apparently will be looking at, of course, it could be almost anything, and we're far enough away that we haven't seen a lot of ideas coming at it. But the state workers' pay increase is probably going to be the biggest issue and the biggest expense that's going to come up. That's something that I know that they'll spend a lot of time looking at.
If I remember right, last year's session was the longest session in the history of the state. And I believe it was the sales tax that went through at the very end of that session. Remind us how controversial that was and how difficult that was to get through.
Well, bear in mind that it was a sales tax increase proposed by a Republican governor who said that his most proud accomplishment at the time was cutting taxes over the course of his term of office. And I think it was extremely difficult for the governor even to make that proposal. And even though his own party controls the legislature, he had a very difficult time persuading the legislature to go along with it. And it took a long, long, long time. Some people just didn't want to give in until we had broken all records, gone 118 days with our legislature when the previous record was, 90, 95? Yeah. It was grueling. And I think that a lot of the legislators are still kind of tired out from last year's session, even now, a year later when we're starting out, and we're looking for a much shorter session this year. And there are a couple reasons for that. One, of course, is that we've got a 2-year sales tax issue that is pushed out beyond what the legislators will deal with this year. But the other is that there's an election coming up. Right. And the primary election in Idaho is on May 25th, and the filing period for candidates has been moved up 2 weeks this year so that it starts on March 8th. So that means while the legislators are still down there in session, sorting out the state budget and so on, back home people are filing to run against them and starting to campaign, and they are going to be very antsy to get on home.
that
get
would
on the
certainly
campaign trail.
shorten the session. Knowing that from observing the political process. Also, I want to talk a little bit about the sales tax exemptions. Governor Kempthorne, I was present during his budget message last year, and I think he was very correct when he said to the legislators when he had to ask for new revenue that in the previous 2 years really cut to the bone. There really is not waste there. And so I'll start with you, Joan. Even though we've got this bailout, what Betsy talked about, both some federal funds for 1 year and also then the sales tax is really producing more revenue. When that sunsets, government just can't continue to operate at its level. There's something called, although it's not been really great, inflation, and there's new capital investments and all of that are needed. I believe I'm correct that there's either 71 or 72 exemptions of sales tax and that we lose hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Would you address that as we go down that road? At some point, I guess you have to face that problem and address it some way.
Well, in many ways, we give away more money in tax exemptions than we do actually in tax collections. And a lot of these exemptions have a very good purpose. Yes. The legislature over the summer and task force went through and started to talk about reviewing those exemptions, going back and looking at some of those, many of those that have been on the books for decades, and saying, does this have a true economic value to the state of Idaho? Because once it kind of gets in, it's always in and never goes back. But it was a committee that ended up doing absolutely nothing because it was just almost not quite a third rail to touch, but there were a lot of people who were quite happy that the committee ended up doing nothing, absolutely nothing, to address the idea of these tax exemptions. I don't think the idea is dead, because I think a lot of people see the value in saying, if we're going to give Company A a tax break, we should see as a public policy issue a value for that dollar. Are there jobs created? Is there revenue enhancement some other way? Is there a public good that comes from that? And it should be, something you can document. We ask our schools to document that our children are doing well, but we don't necessarily ask those companies that get a tax break to show that they're actually doing good for the state of Idaho. So I think that idea is going to sit there, but probably not this year, because one of the chairs of the committee, Representative Dolores Crow, is totally objects to changing that right now. So until she retires, that issue probably won't go very far.
We always bring up difficult questions. I guess it's the educator in us, but if you see sales tax on food, Betsy, and then you turn around and we who go get our hair done and there's no sales tax. Isn't it difficult to defend a policy that taxes food for like low-income individuals but not taxing what one could call luxuries, or more likely to be a luxury?
Certainly, I think that was part of the thinking that went into forming the task force this year, was that Idaho's economy has changed. And so when our sales tax was enacted in 1965, we had an economy that was based on goods, whereas now we have an economy that's more based on services. And our sales tax doesn't tax services, very few services. It does tax goods, including full taxes on groceries, which many states don't do. And that's, of course, very regressive. And so the legislative leadership in setting up this sales tax exemption task force really, I think, was looking for a broad look at what do we want out of our sales tax system. And I think there was some thinking there that this was the answer for when the sales tax increase expires, that we could modernize and reform our sales tax, perhaps broaden it, perhaps extend it to services, make it better match today's Idaho economy, and also lower the rate. And in the bargain, maybe end up taking in the same or even more money each year.
We certainly have changed as an economy. And I have two questions. I'm going to move through a lot of items and then back to Erna, but I'm going to go over to Joan on this one. Another can of worms that is being opened by the courts, and there's in the Constitution of the state, and we just, like all states, we face challenges on the road, and that's the question about what the Constitution says concerning an equal education for each child in the state and the school facilities. And we've had district court decisions, and up the court and back down. It's going back to the court. Predict, maybe that won't be in this session because maybe we won't get a court decision, but isn't that an issue to be faced, or will they deal with it this year?
Well, as you said, it's really in the hands of the court right now until there's some movement at that district court line, until Judge Bale, and you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong on this, Betsy.
Well, it's actually been appealed now up to the Idaho
Supreme Court.
And so a ruling is pending from the Idaho Supreme Court.
The district court did rule the law unconstitutional. The legislature passed.
Two separate district judges have passed rulings on the bill that the legislature passed last year to deal with school facilities, and they've both said it was unconstitutional. And now the state has appealed that to the Idaho Supreme Court.
Right.
And if the court rules during the session
Right.
and agrees with those district judges, then the legislature may well have to act and address something about how to fund school facilities.
And maybe another record-breaking session in length.
It's the last thing they want.
But we are talking many millions of dollars.
Absolutely.
Then another issue that certainly reporters are very interested in. That's why I'll direct both of you because you're in that field. But again, it's I guess there was a meeting of the leaders of both parties in the legislature prior to this session opening, and it dealt with committees and secrecy and behind closed doors. Would you elaborate upon what kind of issue that may be? Maybe that's an issue between legislators and you and the media.
Oh, no, I think it's much broader than that.
Okay.
What was discussed was possibly allowing official meetings of legislative committees to be closed to the public, which is directly forbidden by the Idaho Open Meeting Law, which says all legislative committees shall be open to the public. And the legislature got an Attorney General's opinion last year that said the rules of the House and Senate supersede state law. And the Idaho Constitution's prohibition on any closed session of the legislature doesn't apply to committee meetings. Now, it happens that there are other attorneys out there, including attorneys for the media, who completely disagree with that opinion. And that opinion was just an opinion. But based on that opinion, legislators are saying, well, maybe we better change our rules to take into account that we can have closed meetings of legislative committees. And this, I think, if they were to do it, especially in an election year, would be an extremely unpopular move. There's a long tradition of openness in the Idaho legislature. It's something that's discussed at length even in the Constitutional Convention by the founding fathers of the state when they wrote the Constitution for the state of Idaho. They wondered, should we do some of these things behind closed doors? What if we're talking about appointees to head state departments? Should we consider that in secret? And they decided no. They said they wanted the electric light of publicity to shine on everything that happened in the state capitol. And this would be a historic change.
And it's not an issue of the media. This is an issue of the public. They are spending your dollars. They are deciding who runs your agencies, rules that you live by, laws that you live by. And to close that undermines the public confidence in what they're doing. I want to know what I'm not just a member as a member of the media, but I want to know what the school board's going to do. There's a lot to be said about public openness, and it's
even an expansion. But there's been the debate over caucuses, and I know you've heard that debate and been involved in your interest in that as well as all the public. But this goes far beyond a party's caucus in the House or Senate. It goes into the whole committee system.
Absolutely. And the committee system is where the public is involved in the legislative process.
That's where they testify. No?
Absolutely. If you are a citizen and you're concerned about legislation, that's when the legislature opens its doors and says, anybody who cares, come tell us. Should we change this law or should we not? That's the process they're talking about closing down.
Okay. Arnold Reinhardt.
I want to go back a little bit. We already mentioned this a little bit, but I want to bring it up one more time because it is such a key issue to so many employees throughout the state, and that's the change in employee compensation. And I know that there's lots of people that are going to be watching that very, very closely. Our economy's just starting to come back. We probably don't have a lot of excess money, but there's a lot of people working for state agencies that have gone without raises for many, many years. How do you think that whole issue is going to play out? I know the State Department of Human Resources, I believe, is recommending, they've studied the issue very thoroughly. They've come out with a report. I think they're recommending that state employees get a 6.8% raise for the next 5 years. How do you think that's going to play out for each of the next 5 years, if I understand that right?
Well, if they do nothing, they'll have to face 16,000 state employees at the ballot box. So I think they'll have to do something. It's $5 million for 1% of a pay increase. So you can do your math. If they've got about an $85 million cushion to play with in this next fiscal year, I would say probably a minimum of 3%, which if you work it out is only about a little over 1% a year from the holdback. But it would be interesting. Basically, state employees are about 14 to 15% behind the private sector, and that's a big difference if you're trying to hire good people and keep and retain good people. So there's that twofold issue: the fairness for state employees, but also these are people who are going to vote.
Exactly.
And it's an election year.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I have to
Yeah.
say the legislators have been hearing a ton about this issue. I've talked to quite a number of legislators prior to the start of the session here, and I can't count how many times they said, all anybody wants to talk about is a lack of state employee raises. I think that there's a sense that we have gone enough years with zero raises for state employees that we're in danger of losing some really key, talented people who the state would then have to spend a bunch of money to recruit new people and retrain them, and that we might actually, in some ways, some legislators are telling me, we might save money by raising the pay rather than not raising the pay and losing these highly trained people.
Exactly. I know we've put together a report on how much it costs to attract employees. I mean, there's a cost that's attached to that.
Well, we'll move on then to another subject, and all of those are all challenging, but there's a real interesting thing going on in America following that awful crime on September the 11th in 2001 in New York and Washington, D.C. and Pennsylvania. Obviously, we had to respond to that awful attack and terrorism, but in the rush of doing that, there was a very, very comprehensive, large bill passed, bipartisan in the Congress, overwhelmingly called the Patriot Act. And since there's been more analysis of it, I believe there's, as we talked before the show, about over 100 cities have passed some form of resolution asking at least for it to be examined, and I believe we now have 3 states. The rumors that we hear, and we're doing this on December the 11th, so things may change some, but that there's going to be a resolution in the Idaho legislature to, I don't know what form it'll take, whether to examine it or repeal it. And actually, Congressman Butch Otter from our district has been the most prominent member of Congress in asking for this. In fact, got a bill through the House to make some changes. So what do you foresee in the legislature on this issue? Certainly it'll draw national attention.
I think so. There is a resolution being prepared to oppose the Patriot Act, and particularly insofar as it conflicts with civil liberties. And I think that we're seeing people from all parts of the political spectrum coming together behind that resolution. And I think that it will pass easily, and I think that it will get quite a bit of attention. There is also another effort out there that's getting quite a bit less attention. Senator Marty Calabretta from Osborne is working on a bill that targets library records, because one of the big concerns about the Patriot Act is that it could allow federal agents to obtain records of what books people have checked out from libraries, which raises many concerns. And Senator Calabretta is looking into possibly requiring that libraries destroy those records promptly before anyone could snoop into them. Now, that would be a significant change and would change the way the Patriot Act could be enforced in Idaho.
Well, you know, if you check out a book and then when you turn it in, they have to keep a record while you have the book, but when you turn it in, do they need any records because you returned the book? Jonah, let's get you in on this part.
There's a certain irony involved that there very much is a big move on the Patriot Act, and yet there's still people talking about closing their own meetings.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's kind of, it's like, okay, if civil liberties are good at the federal level, they're also good at the state level. And you should, I just thought I'd throw that idea out.
Oh, really? Are you discussing something called consistency? But it is something important, and I think our congressman has been very much admired by many across the board for his concern. And Idahoans are, really there's one thing about Idahoans that's certainly those who've lived their whole life here, they do have a great appreciation for their own privacy. And so I have just one follow-up question in relation to that issue, and that is that, and it also involves librarians. Betsy did this, and in politics so often the right and the left and the middle, they're really on different sides. What makes this movement so fascinating and so powerful is people from very conservative to very liberal positions are in the same political camp on this. And what does that mean not only in Idaho but across the country? Doesn't it add great momentum and power to this?
Well, although not all Republicans are on board.
No.
No. If you are, senators voted for the Patriot Act. Representative Otter stood alone in that in opposing that. They've now since changed, moved their position on that. But there are some people who still follow and believe that the Patriot Act was the right way to go. So it's not a slam dunk when it hits the legislative floor.
At the national level, both some Democrats and Republicans who voted for it are saying, "I wish I would have known some of the details of this." And I heard some of them being interviewed said, "I want to keep it but amend it." And so, but I guess even outside of the political elected officials, I'm fascinated with the number, and I'll go back to you, Betsy, of political activists that are rarely together, that are together on this issue.
It's one of those rare issues that crosses party lines. We've seen a few of those in recent years. The term limits issue, for example, brought together people from very different political camps. And I think in Idaho, because we have such one-party dominance, the Republicans hold so many of the seats in the legislature, all but one of the statewide elected positions, the entire congressional delegation, that it makes sense that we're starting to see some issues that are not partisan issues, because if everything's a partisan issue, then everybody has already decided it because they simply hold all the seats, have all the votes.
Mm-hmm. And one other thing before I go back to Erna, and that is the legislature had adopted another procedure in which you could pre-file bills as members of the House and Senate, but or I believe both houses you could, at least you could in the House. You could pre-file both, I believe.
There was at one point the Senate could, and then they eliminated it, and then the House added it,
and now
the
neither
House
one
has
are going to.
eliminated
Would you like to speak to that issue, why that you think that they've chosen to not have pre-filing of bills?
There seemed to be a sense that it wasn't working very well, or that the bills perhaps weren't that well thought out when they were pre-filed because they hadn't gone through the committee process, because during the session a committee has to actually take a vote to even print a bill and assign it a bill number to make it a bill. And some ideas don't make it through that process. There is one way around that. Early in the session, legislators can introduce personal bills without a vote of a committee. But I think the majority of the bills that were pre-filed tended to be agency bills, and they're out there so early, and that has a good side and a bad side. The good side is everyone becomes aware of those bills and can have their say on it. Perhaps a bad side is they kind of get nitpicked to death because they're the only thing out there for anyone to work on right off. And so I'm not sure exactly why they decided to do away with them, but it's interesting that the Senate used to have this, and then they did away with it, so then the House had it, and now they have
I didn't mean to suggest that it's one of the major issues. These others are much greater.
Part of the yes. You know, I always think of the legislature as it's a big process, like a ball game. There are issues and things go this way and that way, and it's part of the minutia of how it works. And sometimes it's those little procedural things that make a tremendous difference in the big picture.
Yeah, right. Erna Reinhardt.
Interesting. Both of you, I think, are very seasoned reporters and are very familiar with the legislature. And I'm really intrigued with how an election year may change either the personality or the feel of how things progress through the session. Can you speak a little bit about just the effects of it being an election year and how that may change things? Joan, sorry.
Well, there's those who say people will stand up and give longer speeches if the camera's on because they think there's a chance that they're going to, get some free TV time or get some free print time. So there's those who may do a more, make sure they have their face out more often, and or they'll find an issue that they think will resonate back in their district and they will bring it forth. And then I think this year, because the election deadline moved up, I also think this is going to be a year where they're going to get in, get out, because they don't want to be there to have someone who's back home saying, look what this person is doing to you, vote for me because I can campaign while this guy's back working.
Interesting.
I think that it definitely has an effect on the session, that it's an election year, and at the same time that the legislators will be trying to wind things up very quickly and get back to campaign, it's even more important for people to pay attention to what they're doing, because right at the end of the legislative session, people will have an opportunity to cast their vote on how they feel they're being represented, whether these people are doing a good or a bad job. And they shouldn't let it just be, covered over and dealt with quickly. It may happen quickly, but it's definitely worth watching. I think even more so in an election year.
And are there some legislators that have already announced that they're not going to run or seek re-election?
A couple of prominent ones have. Senator Sheila Sorensen, the chairman of the Senate State Affairs Committee, has announced that she won't be coming back.
Representative Dolores Crow also, but I should always warn you. Sometimes they change their mind.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Senator Sorensen will, but it has Senator Richardson made a very long speech at the end, and then filed and ran again. So.
After a retirement party.
That's one thing that should be interesting for people to watch, not only what they're doing, but who's donating to their campaigns. Because this time it will also be a big fundraising time. As legislative races have gone from, what used to be, you used to be able to run a race for $3,000, $4,000 to now in Boise it's, $15, $16, $20, $25, $30,000. It's a lot of money to raise on what is effectively a local race. And I think that's something people should be aware of, is who is giving to this candidate.
There was a major educational endeavor at the national level. President George W. Bush and Senator Ted Kennedy, two very powerful forces combining together, got through a very major educational bill, and it's been best known as "No Child Left Behind" is the slogan. And I know that there's implementation and there's rules and regulations that must be done at the state level. And that will be part of the session too. Betsy, you want to start telling us?
There's a rules review process whereby the legislature at the beginning of its session reviews all the rules that agencies have enacted. And these are rules that are supposed to carry out laws, but they're kind of where the rubber meets the road. And it's a bureaucratic process and can be hard to get your hands around, but some very significant things come out there. And these No Child Left Behind rules are among them. They will be reviewed this year, and they're very much changing the way that education works in Idaho.
Things that look like, is there a make or break test for high school students? That's a big issue. How are they going to deal with the teacher education requirements? There are a number of very significant issues that are going to be hidden in the rules and regs that you'll find in that first month of session. So for your school kids, this is an important time to look at. And I think in the Boise area, we've had legislators get upset over the busing, which is not necessarily to No Child Left Behind, but in education, funding for busing. All that money plays into it as well, because much of No Child Left Behind, although it was a federally mandated program, it essentially came without dollars, and that's being turned into the state. So the state's having to pick up some of the costs of all the testing that's being done and the results of those tests.
And in addition to those new needs that the state will need to fund, the state has seen its endowment earnings drop off seriously. And there's been recent agreement among land board members, at least tentatively, that they want to cut the amount of endowment money that schools receive each year. Now, that money is on top of the general tax budget that schools get, and it looks like it will be a $16.3 million hit to the schools next year. And unless the legislature comes up with money to replace that from the general fund budget, schools will be hit.
The other thing, though, there's a number of things, and Percy is a good example. There's the retirement fund, and there are others that the stock market has been going back up, which is very encouraging, and so there'll be some recapturing of some monies, but we're just almost out of time. I would, just in a little bit of time, you both will be involved. Tell us a little bit about what you expect on Idaho Reports. It's a great nightly program for us to know what's going on.
It is. It's a wonderful program. Friday nights it airs, 8 o'clock. Betsy Russell and Bob Fick, and we'll have Greg Hahn as well this year. We'll be doing some commentary for us, so we appreciate that. Hope people tune in. You can go to the Idaho Reports website if you want to actually listen, no matter, of course, where you are. You have World Wide
Web. Can you give
Web.
us that website?
It's idahoptv.org. Click on Idaho Reports, and you can listen to the legislative sessions, the floor sessions, JFAC sessions through there. So that's easy and free on your computer, and then we have, of course, links to wonderful papers like the Spokesman Review, as well as our own coverage. So check that out.
We thank all of you, because the greatest way for citizens to participate in a democracy is to be informed, and so you're a great avenue for them. And I do want to take time to thank Idaho Public Television for inviting us to do this program. We're on that every week, but with this particular show, but to be able to review it and have you both here, thank you from the Spokesman Review and your people allowing you to do it, and also the Idaho Reports. It's been wonderful and very, very informative, and good luck, and we'll look forward to reading and hearing during the session. Ladies and gentlemen, please join us again next week at the same time. We'll interview another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.